Here we go. Greetings, Adirondack Wilderness Advocate supporters. I am Pete Nelson, Board Chair of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates, and here we are with yet another of our series of video casts on interesting and important and sometimes even obscure Adirondack topics. This one's not so obscure. We're going to talk a little bit about remoteness today from a specific point of view or through a specific lens. And as many of you know, remoteness is one of the main things that we're working on. Fortunately, you don't have to listen to me talking about remoteness because we have two experts with us today who are much more fluent in the issues that are really important in today's discussion. One is our own board member, Janelle Jones. Janelle is also the New York Land Steward for the Northeast Wilderness Trust. She's with us today. Hello, Janelle.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this.
Oh, it's fun. And then we have the one and only John Davis. John Davis is with the Adirondack Council. He's a rewilding advocate, but he's been spent a lifetime of expertise in the forest and wilderness protection, and specifically rewilding. He's with the Rewilding Institute. He was the executive director. He is currently serves as scout, editor, interviewer, and writer. He's on the boards of Restore the North Woods, the Eddy Foundation, and the Algonquin Adirondack Conservation Collaborative. So we're really thrilled to have John Davis with us. Hello, John. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here, Pete, with you and Janelle.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's great to have you here. I know we'll have a good discussion. So when we talk about remoteness, the obvious question is, why are we so interested in advocating for it? And it really falls into a couple different pieces. But as, again, many of you know, we currently have a proposal before the Adirondack Park Agency to measure it. And our advocacy toward them, in which we have great allies, including the Adirondack Council, is to make the argument that by measuring it and establishing baselines, we can better protect it. And we can see how the impact of various actions or proposed management actions will affect remoteness, which is a really scarce resource. Even here in the Adirondacks, there are not very many places that are significantly remote. Some people will say, well, remoteness is how we feel about it, right? A lot of people would say remoteness is 50 yards inside the park. And I agree with that. But measuring it is important for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that whatever I think about remoteness, it's not what a moose thinks about remoteness, or a bobcat thinks about remoteness, or a wolf, if we ever see wolf restoration here, feels about remoteness. You know, they have different measures than we do. So our argument is that remoteness is important to measure because it's not just a subjective thing that people can enjoy. It's an ecological matter. It's a matter for flora and fauna, and particularly for today's discussion, is important for wildlife. And that's why we're lucky to have our two specialists with us today. So I guess my first question for you, is for you, John. In your own words, since you're a member of both organizations, why did the Adirondack Council and the Rewilding Institute sign on to our proposal to measure remoteness?
Excellent question, Pete. I believe it's in large part because the Adirondack Council has a mission of protecting the wild character and ecological integrity of New York's great Adirondack Park. And remoteness is one of the best measures of ecological integrity and wild character. Remoteness, as Pete, you've explained in many contexts, is not the same as solitude. It's a complementary concept, but it is measurable, whereas solitude really is not. And as you said earlier, remoteness matters deeply for many wildlife species. It's not that any one species will disappear if there's a road within a mile of its den or nest, but many animal species and probably some plant species tend to do better, tend to be safer in deep, remote habitats. The Rewilding Institute would see things the same way, and the Rewilding Institute is also very committed to large carnivore recovery and to the reconnection and protection of vast landscapes. The best possible place in the East for achieving a truly rewilded landscape probably is Adirondack Park.
Sure. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is the fact that this doesn't have anything to do with land classifications. We, AWA, we advocate for the best interests of public lands, but this is an issue for all lands, right? Remoteness simply is remoteness, regardless of whose land it is or where exactly we are. So, Janelle, I wonder if you could just comment briefly. You are the New York land steward for the Northeast Wilderness Trust. So you're taking care of significant parcels here in New York State and in the Adirondacks that the Northeast Wilderness Trust manages. How is the issue of remoteness important to the work that you do?
Yeah, I think well, I think to answer that question, to set the stage a little bit for anybody who might not be familiar with the Northeast Wilderness Trust. So we are a big regional land trust that operates across the Northeast, as the name implies, in the New England states and in northern New York. And there are a lot of land trusts that are working around the country that are all doing amazing things, from protecting farmland to building trails, and some are even conserving land for timber harvesting. But the Northeast Wilderness Trust is unique in that we are doing things our own way and doing things a little differently, and exclusively working to protect wildlands. So those are the wilderness areas that we're talking about, not state managed wilderness, but privately owned, managed by a nonprofit wilderness. And right now, the Northeast Wilderness Trust is working across over 104,000 acres in the service area, and 11,600 plus of those acres are right here in New York. A lot of it right in the Adirondack Park. And so, putting all of that in the context of remoteness and looking at it through a wilderness lens, I think that we are all kind of working towards the same goal. And that's to find an area or conserve an area or protect an area that is free from human influence. And like Pete and John have said, the Adirondack Wilderness Advocates and the others who have submitted the proposal for remoteness measurements are looking for that quantitative measurement for it. So a physical way to measure the distance from things, and that can be replicated from person to person. But we know that wilderness is a little more complicated because there are some social values that go along with it. It's a cultural construct, and I know a lot of people say that, but what does that mean? And it just means that what the wilderness is that it could depend on what your values are, or that what we as humans, what values we place on an area. So the Wilderness Trust defines wilderness as a place that has where we allow for freedom for the land and the plants and the animals that live there, and freedom for them to evolve in their own way. There's no influence by humans. We're not telling anybody what to do. The beavers are going to do what beavers do best, and the white pines are going to do what the white pines want to do. So the wilderness, as we see it, is a commitment to protecting that land's freedom. And New York State does it a little bit differently. Like, they have managed trails, lean-tos, structures, things like that. That is a big part of the wilderness story here in the Adirondacks. The Wilderness Trust just does it a little bit differently, with probably a more ecocentric way of looking at things. And I think that the real takeaway here is that the grand scheme, the goal at the end of it, is to find some similar qualities that are similar to remote areas and similar to wilderness. And that quality, the big one, is that they're areas where human influence or human impact on the land is minimal or non-existent.
Right, minimal or non-existent. So I'm going to turn the discussion over to the two of you, but there's a theme in there that leads to a question that sounds kind of silly, but I'll put the question in the air and then let you talk about all of the parameters around it. But the question is, how remote is remote? Janelle, you talked about the fact that it is a subjective quality to human beings, but when you talk about white pines being free to be white pines and bobcats being free to be bobcats, how much room do they need? How do we think about those things? The large question for me is how remote is remote? So if both of you want to go off to the races on that, it'd be great.
I'm happy to start with a few rough numbers. The farthest, well, I guess I would say in measuring in measuring remoteness, the farther from roads, the better. The farther from other types of motorized conveyance, the better. The more that roads and mechanical contrivances impinge upon an otherwise natural area, the less remote it is. Why that matters, again, is partly because some animals are very sensitive to human disturbance, because the fracture zones, the cuts that humans put into a landscape tend to usher in invasive species. So we pay a lot of attention, very rightly, about the problem of invasive species in Adirondack Park. We have a whole excellent program, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. Where invasive species go is largely a consequence of human activities. They tend to go where our power lines go, where our roads go, where our cars go. One of the best ways to limit the spread of invasive species is to protect big, wild, connected habitats. Those are the remote places. And if you want to choose just one measure, probably distance from roads is the most important measure. There were studies in Minnesota years ago showing that generally speaking, you lose wolves from a landscape when the road density goes above a half a mile per square mile. I think it would be fair to say that the less tolerant people are of wide-ranging and sensitive wildness of wildlife, the more remoteness you need. That is, if people would be perfectly willing to coexist with wolves and cougars and other wide-ranging toothy animals, then roads would not be such a big, they'd still be a concern, but they would not be as big a concern. But because we have many people who will not tolerate and may have reason to not tolerate, it's hard if you're trying to make a living as a farmer to be fully accepting of the presence of carnivores sometimes. If we don't, if the higher the level of acceptance, then the less the issue matters. But we don't have full acceptance of carnivores. We do see persecution of these animals, and so we need big, remote, road-free areas where they can thrive and humans have minimal impact. Oh, and by the way, I was going to give numbers. The farthest you can get from a road in the lower 48 states is a mere 21 miles in the heart of Yellowstone National Park. The farthest you can get from a road in Adirondack Park is only about 5 miles. To my mind, that's a pathetically short distance to be able to get from a road. Janelle, what would you add?
Well, I would just those numbers that you just gave. I just wrote a blog on our Wilderness Advocates website about me trying to find the most remote location in Delaware, which which you will probably be surprised to learn is 3.2 miles from a road. So they're in
Really?
yeah, it's in a wildlife refuge on the edge of the ocean, and there's a whole story to be told there about shipping channels and what remote actually is, but that's another story for another another podcast probably. Um, I think I think when we're talking about remoteness and animals and disturbance, my mind always goes to birds, which will probably not surprise anybody who's listening because that's where my mind usually is. Um, but um I think there's a misconception that maybe people humans are going out there and disturbing things on purpose, and a lot of disturbance that I've noticed is as accidental and things that we just shake up without meaning to. And I'll throw myself under the bus here. I'll use myself as an example. One day I was bushwhacking a few springs ago at the Wilderness Trust Preserve in Mariah, New York. I was walking down an old logging road and I realized I flushed a little brown bird from the ground. It was a thrush. I think it was a veery. And I took a few more steps and realized that I scared that poor little bird right off its nest. And sitting there right in the middle of the logging road was a perfect little nest with a couple little blue eggs in it. Um, and I felt terrible. So no, nobody come at me. I apologized profusely to the bird. I I paid the price there. Um, so I think that when we're talking about disturbances and that with a lot of people will go to carnivores, but it's important for all sorts of wildlife too. Even the little birds that are closely related to robins. And especially during the breeding season when birds are trying to save up enough energy to raise their young. They don't need to be spending it on flying away and running from careless bushwhackers on wilderness preserves like myself.
John, Janelle, do we have some sense of what kinds of disturbances are? I've certainly, Don, you talked about roads and motorized activity. What physical effects of these activities, including other human activities, are the most concerning? Can we even say that what they are?
Um, I think I think when we try to answer that question, it's kind of easy to vilify somebody and say that, oh, well, logging is bad and that's caused all sorts of problems for a lot of animals. But we all use wood products, so we can't say that that's the total villain of every story. But managing land for resources, logging, for example, changes the characteristic of that landscape, which determines what kind of creatures are there. There's a lot of birds that depend on early successional forest, and then there's a lot of birds that are much happier in old growth forest. So when there's disturbances with road noise, logging, even natural disturbances like big blowdowns could change the whole character of that forest and impact what might be found there.
Sure. And John, it is just the presence of a road and roadbed, um, motorized activity being obviously the most intrusive thing in a lot of levels, but isn't it true that just the presence of a wide enough roadbed and the disturbance that it represents as a barrier is one of the things that we ought to worry about when we're talking about remote places?
Yes, there's a whole science to road ecology. You could assemble a small library of books and papers, scientific papers on the effects of roads. Just to begin, the thinnest surface of a summary, roads bring invasive species. They potentially bring poachers. Most hunters are law-abiding, ethical people, but there are a few less ethical people out there who will willingly poach. That's a whole lot easier if there's a road into an area. Unfortunately, some all-terrain vehicle drivers do not obey rules, do not obey laws, and use roads even on private land, even if they're posted no trespassing. Roads alter microclimates. They can cause desiccation of the trees alongside. They alter the behavior of the native animals too. I can remember years ago reading about spruce grouse being imperiled in some areas, partly because coyotes very opportunistically use roads. So, an endangered species being imperiled partly by another native species that paradoxically has learned to take advantage of roads. You could say that in some instances, roads are attractive nuisances, that animals will use them, but to the detriment of other, perhaps more sensitive animals, or in some cases to the detriment of themselves. A cougar, perhaps in the Everglades or elsewhere, walking a road, uh, may do so because it's the easiest way to get someplace, but it makes that animal more vulnerable to roadkill or to poachers or to accidentally stepping in a trap. So there's a whole host of harmful effects that come with roads. And again, as Janelle said earlier about logging, we all use roads. I came on roads to work today. I'm not, nobody's calling for closing all roads, or at least nobody in this conversation. But we need to realize that roads have serious impacts on wildlife. And again, I think the purest measure of remoteness is the amount of road-free area.
Indeed, I know that one of the measures that's become common in the science and practice is road density.
Mhm.
But we're also interested in just raw distance from the road, including disturbance zones. There begs a big question, though, because of course we talk a lot about roads as we should. And as a wilderness advocacy organization, there are multiple ways in which we have talked about roads. What about foot trails?
Janelle, Newt pays a lot of attention to this. I'll have some things to say, but why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Janelle.
Oh, you can finish your thought, Pete, if you were adding on to the question.
Well, I was just wondering, is management of foot trails and consideration of the impact that they have something that is, if not equally important, is important enough that we should be paying attention to that as part of our policy?
I think I'm trying to remember what I want to cite here so I don't cite it wrong. And I don't know if the information's going to come as quickly to my brain as I want it to. So I might paraphrase what I'm remembering. Um there was something some time ago I read a study that was saying um moose like to walk down the roads because like John was saying it's easier than fighting through the forest. And then there it went on to say something that the moose might be less likely to be disturbed by a snowmobile because they zip by, then the disturbance is gone quickly. But hiking, that noise lingers longer because we're talking and we move slower on our feet than a snowmobile. So there's a lot of interesting things going on out there, and I don't know if but don't quote me on any of that. I don't know how accurate it all is. But that's somewhere lodged in my brain. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to think about with what level of noise and what kind of impact it could have. And I know the Wilderness Trust, most of the lands we conserve don't have trails. They're not designed to promote that kind of recreation. That they're certainly open for bushwhacking and human powered recreation, but trail building is not within our mission. And I think that is just because we work more, like I was saying, to promote that ecocentric vision and give the wildlife a place to thrive and a place to live their life instead of having another place where humans are kind of dictating how things move along.
Sure. I'm going to give you an assist here. Um,
Okay.
no, that
I
was
need it.
great. But the reason I can give you an assist is because I know about at least a little bit of this, which is some of the work that the Wildlife Conservation Society has done, where they had plausible evidence. We can't. I think more science is needed. I think everybody agrees that the more science and study and research we can do, the better. But they had plausible evidence to suggest exactly what you said, that there is a concern that human movement on foot trails is more upsetting than some other types of activity, including snowmobiling or mountain biking, because of the pace, because they're slower, because they linger. It has a greater impact, which I think just suggests that we have a lot to learn and a lot to think about yet. It's a complicated issue, and I think some of AWA's efforts to promote measuring and defending remoteness have taken the time they've taken because there's a lot to sort out. Even though in one way, in one sense, it's a simple idea, what it means particularly for wildlife, or as John, you mentioned, for invasive species and the challenges with that, it is not by any means simple at all. So um, in the efforts to establish, so John, one of the things I know that you work on a lot is the effort to establish connected habitats and wildlife corridors. And I wonder how, when you're trying to plan how to to make those things happen and make that connectivity as maximal as possible. I wonder how the work to figure out where trails should or shouldn't go impacts what you do, how you go about that.
Crucial question. I love trails. I spend much of my life walking trails, but I am aware they do have effects. As Janelle said, they can bring in invasive species, less likely to do so than larger roads, but they do. You can f find plenty of places on trails, especially if the trails are being used by horses, that where invasive species are coming in. And as human beings on foot can appear predatory and often do scare animals. Sometimes, ironically, a person on foot may scare an animal more than a car or a snowmobile, as you mentioned, Pete. But I think that's a little bit misleading, though. If somebody were to argue really trails are just as bad as roads, I would strongly disagree. For one thing, roads, I mean, trails come from roads. If you want to lessen use of trails, close the roads leading to it. You know, the very popular trails in the high peaks, they'd get a whole lot less use if there weren't for the cherry stem roads penetrating deep into the high peaks wilderness. So roads lead to trails, so the problems compound. But I think it is important, particularly in narrow wildlife corridors, to site any trails really carefully with great sensitivity. Don't go in places where bobcats may want to sun themselves, which would often be south-facing ledges. Don't go into deep interior forest that's so important for songbirds if it's limited. Don't go near sensitive wetlands that might be contaminated by invasive species brought in by people. It's very important. I think trails are an excellent tool for promoting wildlife habitat protection and restoration. The Appalachian Trail is perhaps the most famous example in the world of a trail that has become so popular. It has inspired land conservation alongside its whole length very successfully. And that was part of the original vision of Benton MacKaye. And that vision has been, in a sense, replicated along the Pacific Crest Trail, along the Continental Divide Trail. So trails can inspire conservation. They can reconnect people with wild nature. That's wonderful, but we should be really careful where we put trails. And generally speaking, in Adirondack Park, I think we have plenty of trails. I don't think we need many more trails here. I was on the board of Champlain Area Trails for some years, and I strongly support that group. It's an excellent land trust. They've done a terrific job of creating a trail system that helps lessen some of the pressure on the more popular trails in the high peaks. But there have been times at CATS where I've said, I don't think we really need a trail here. I think this is sensitive habitat. I think it would be better to leave it trail free. And I applaud Northeast Wilderness Trust for leaving some places without trails. And those of us who are determined to go there, well, not on Newtlands necessarily, but on state lands without trails, we're all free to walk wherever we want on forest preserve lands, with or without trails.
That's a really good point. One dear to my heart because I really don't like being on trails at all, but I love being in the forest preserve. And so I have to ask both of you, have either of you or both of you spent much time in the Sentinel Wilderness, which has been defined by the DEC as to remain trailless? John's nodding yes.
Yeah,
Jill, have you been in the Sentinel Wilderness?
I've gone up a couple of the higher mountains there. It's wonderful. Yeah, I love the Sentinel Wilderness. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something satisfying, even romantic about a completely trailless area, and of course there is a lot of that. I guess I'll just ask a final question, and we can wrap this up. I really appreciate your time, though. If we can affect state policy, so that remoteness is a more robust consideration than it is today, where it is mentioned in the state land master plan, but really only peripherally compared to other things. If we can affect state policy, what might a better policy and management approach to remoteness look like in, I don't know, 5 years, something like that?
Janelle, you want to go first?
Oh boy. I think I think that um for remoteness, looking down the line, it'll be important to recognize and to communicate with everybody in New York and beyond, to spread that education and knowledge that we the Adirondack Wilderness Advocates and others are not trying to make roads go away. We're not trying to make every place as remote as possible, but there needs to be some way out there to protect and measure the areas that are remote, and that we know here in the United States that it's our collective differences that make it all great. And I think that that can be applied to remoteness, that we need a little bit of everything to make to make the world to make the world go round, if I can use that cheesy little phrase there.
John, final thought?
I think that the remoteness policy that you and other Adirondack wilderness advocates and the good folks at Adirondack Council, the Rewilding Institute, have articulated and crafted is a really good, strong proposal. I would say I think that a good goal would be to increase remoteness in and around Adirondack Park. Paul Ehrlich, many years ago, the late great Paul Ehrlich, who just recently passed away, wrote an important essay, oh, it's probably 20 or more years ago in conservation biology. I vaguely remember it, in which he, I think, essentially called for a policy in the United States of no net loss of habitat. We should not allow any more additional losses of wildlife habitat, any more than can be avoided. And where we do lose wildlife habitat, we should compensate for it with restoration elsewhere. I think that would be a good goal in Adirondack Park, to increase total remoteness and wildness across Adirondack Park. And I think one way to do that is to think about roads that are really not needed, roads to nowhere, roads that penetrate the forest preserves that really do not serve vital interests. Those are really expensive to maintain. We, the taxpayers, pay the DEC to maintain those roads. In my opinion, quite unnecessarily. I'd like to see some of those roads, especially if they're cherry stem roads going essentially to no vital infrastructure. I'd like to see those closed and remoteness increased.
Wonderful. Our one of our co-founders, Bill Ingersoll, who knows the Adirondack Park better than anybody I can think of, inventoried a lot of different roads that are, as you say, roads to nowhere, roads that aren't really used or aren't really necessary. And I want to hearken to what you said, Janelle, that we're not after just closing roads all over the place and making life more difficult for people in our communities. But what we are after is smart decisions about where they're needed and where they're not, and where roads and trails should be routed to protect remoteness. That said, you can be sure, supporters, that Adirondack Wilderness Advocates is playing a long game here. The first step we want is to have measurements that are objective, that can be used. As if we get the APA to agree to that in the proposal that our groups have presented, our next step as a wilderness advocacy organization is absolutely to call for increases in remoteness, just as you said, John. It's not enough just to protect what we have because there's so little. We can increase remoteness, and it's such a scarce resource, and it's so ecologically important. I think we have a moral imperative to do it myself, and we can do it by being smart, not making bad choices for the people who live here, but making really good choices for the ecology, the park, and the wildlife that also lives here. So with that said, I'd like to thank you, Janelle. I'd like to thank you, John. I thought this was a great discussion. If you AWA supporters also enjoyed it, keep supporting us. Keep looking for our action alerts when we're ready for your help on this. And never hesitate to make a donation to the cause. So I will sign off with that. Thank you very, very much. And I wish you all a wonderful day.